I'm Sarah Erickson. I serve as ALLLM team leader and as the Director of Lifelong Learning for Columbia Seminary. Welcome to our Adaptive Approaches Part 2. We are going to, you're going to hear from all of the team leaders today as we hand off to one another, moving as quickly as we can to revisiting last time's discussion and having plenty of time for discussion of some additional questions today. And as people come in, we're not going to stop now to do introductions, but we are going to ask when we break you into the breakout groups that you quickly introduce yourself to one another when we get into those groups. So without further ado, I would invite our web editor, webinar host, at-large member from Toronto, Stephen Fetter, to go ahead with the next step of housekeeping.
Sure. So welcome, folks. Good to have you here. I imagine you're living with almost as many Zoom meetings these days as I am, so I'm not sure I need to do a whole lot of introduction to Zoom the way I might have done 3 months ago.
Who's a good girl?
But we're glad you're here. Is there anything you need to know about the technology before we kind of jump into it, or are you all comfortable with where we're at?
Don't tell me you don't remember how to sit.
You're talking to your dog.
I don't think you're talking to me, but it's delightful to have you here. That's one of those Zoom things we're not supposed to do, right? Is talk to the dog while the host is talking.
Then we would miss out on the comedy. So
that's right, absolutely. Anyway, I'm not sure that we need to do a whole lot of technical introduction. Why don't we open with prayer? And I'm going to pull up my candle that I use on all my worship services. Sarah won the prize and noticed that I'm celebrating Pentecost still in my office down here, so which is why I have my wife's dress hanging behind me, because that was a great Pentecost banner for Sunday. Looks even better when she's wearing it, but it was a good way to celebrate Pentecost on Sunday. Anyway, take a moment to remember why we're here. Take a moment to remember all of the different people who come to the different continuing education programs that we offer. Take a moment to remember the desperate need to empower our leaders, particularly in this crazy time. And let's invite God into our conversation. As we gather not just as colleagues and not just as friends, we gather as God's people, surrounded by the light and warmed by it and strengthened by it and inspired by it. And so let us pray. Loving God, thank you. Thank you for this time together. Thank you for the opportunity to gather as colleagues. Thank you for your presence in the midst of that conversation. Blow your spirit of Pentecost through and among us, that we might hear where you are calling and follow where you lead. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Hello, I'm Erica Knisely. I'm Director of Programs for Education Beyond the Walls at Austin Seminary. That's our lifelong learning arm there. I'm also Treasurer for ALLLM. And I want to spend a little time just reflecting on what we did as a group last time. And I wanted to see by a show of hands, how many of you were on our webinar last time around? Some of you don't have your video on, and that's fine. It looks like a majority of us were on. We had a very ambitious agenda last time, and we got through about 2/3 of it. So we're going to talk about that 2/3 in a very truncated way. Stephen is sharing a PowerPoint that we've created, thanks to Josh. And want to just walk through that really quickly. These were the questions that we had last time. Name what we've lost, name the reality today, what's different, what constraints. It's kind of a SWOT analysis. What tools and resources do we have? How can they be reapplied? What topics are emerging right now that church leaders need? How do we need to adapt our teaching strategies? Really, we're focusing on adaptive change. If you could share the next slide, Stephen. I believe this is a graphic a lot of text on here, but I'm just going to walk through this quickly about what we said in our different small groups that covered these areas. And when you talked about what was lost, really were familiar structures, and I would say identities, and maybe how we perceived our world, where we're really seeing the rifts made visible in society, economically, socially, and I think we can add to that in a very deep way racially. Since we last talked, we're losing bodies, the physical touch and the ability to read body language, that physical presence that gives us so much information. We are feeling stressed over, especially continuing educators in institutions, stressed over a perceived or potential loss of value and what a recession might mean for us. We've lost connectional pathways that are normative for our work. Meetings with alums or people in the hallways, those sidebar conversations that you have that are so generative during in-person gatherings. And also support from our institutions, from the places where we're housed, whether it's tech support or otherwise. We're doing a lot of this in new ways without that kind of physical support. So focusing now on what's emerging in terms of the tools and resources that we have, we all feel a sense of expanded reach, or at least the potential for that we could capitalize on, that we could share with one another, some of the specialties that we have, that we can offer pastors, and we've already been doing this, but offer pastors a space for connection across greater physical distances. We know that pastors need support from their peers, and this is something we can do in online space and have been doing. We are able to respond to the emerging needs of denominations and resource them. And this is requiring us to expand ourselves in terms of our comfort level with online resources. We need to get better at doing online learning and teaching and adapting what we already know about andragogy and good active learning strategies to digital space, also realizing that we've got to do that in shorter time segments and increase the interaction, still use small groups, find ways for people to still have intimate experiences and figure out what hospitality means. It's not just about feeding people. We can't feed people food, provide them comfortable space. How can we translate some of that into our digital space? And then really having an ear to the ground on what church leaders are needing. I'd say really helping them discern where to focus their energies and what tools to use when, helping them manage their anxiety through different phases of this pandemic, you know, that kind of initial phase and now sort of the new normal, but the changing normal, helping them, supporting them to develop new rituals and new ways of connecting. And as we already had a moment this morning with Helen and her lovely dog, the melding of the personal with the public, and how do you navigate that? So this is a lot of what we talked about last time, which is setting us up for what we're going to talk about today. And Josh is going to frame that discussion for us now. Josh?
Josh, you need to unmute yourself, please. There you go.
I do have to unmute myself. So sorry. Thank you, Eric, for that. And I just wanted to maybe just let us sit with what we just heard and what we were thinking about, like where we were last month and all the time and all the things that have happened since then and where we are now. And as we hear these things, what strikes you now? Where are you currently at? Do you want to, is there anything that you would like to add to this list? Maybe take a moment just to think about that. And then when you're ready, to maybe put something in the chat. Since we have so many people here, I think for a large group, maybe we can just note something in the chat that if you have something to share. So this will be a little slower, and then we'll we'll just take a couple of comments, not too many, so that way we can get to the small groups as quickly as possible. But anything that you're kind of sitting with right now in relation to these particular tools and strategies and teaching changes and opportunities, what's striking you right now? So Rick adds, how will the church be different going forward? What kind of pastoral leadership is needed for a new church? Rick, do you want to add to that at all?
Well, one of the conversations I've been having with colleagues, both in our Lutheran group, but also I'm part of a planning team for at Ignite the Church Conference in Orlando next February, is recognizing the fact that we will be a different church going forward after this pandemic. We cannot be the same. We're not going to go back to being the same church that we were. And so we're trying to figure out how can we provide training for pastors and lay leaders. First of all, help them envision what this new church is going to look like and how we're going to be different, but also how their leadership needs to be different going forward.
That's great. And I'm actually going to jump down to Helen's comment because it touches base with what you just said, that this is truly a post-ascension church. We're waiting still for the Pentecost moment, which I think is a really evocative image there. And I think many of us have touched on that in our own houses of worship, this idea of maybe this liminal in-between space that we're living in. And we're in a different space than we were a couple of months ago, but it's still this. And of course, with everything that's happened over the last weekend in the United States in particular, there's just a lot of things moving, and the ground underneath us might not feel particularly steady. So I think the question of how will we be different? What are we doing? How are we going to react and be proactive in this new environment? I think that's very important. Sarah mentioned that we need to stop and reflect as we move along. So this idea of moving, but also reflecting. Sarah, did you want to add to that?
Not so much. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I'm not the only one. That some things that we are testing and are not working now might be something that we would want to draw back from as we move farther through this time of extended disruption. And if we don't stop and sort of do this mid-course, however long that course is, collection, we might miss some things.
Yeah. Need the balance. Stephen mentioned about an article he read that says the pandemic is accelerating the demise of churches that are teetering financially. I think a lot of us, and Helen saw this in theological schools as well. I think we've been talking about the demise of churches and theological schools for the last decade, and now this is just going to accelerate the financial issues and impact that we're having. I do, that reminds me of something that I'm in the United Church of Christ in the Massachusetts area, the Southern New England Conference, and our conference minister, Don Remick, shared something with a group of, I'm on the committee on ministry, and he shared with us some information about that and how this is actually affecting a lot of the smaller churches. But it's also almost as more about mission as it is about size. In that the churches that have a clear sense of who they are, whether they're small or they're big, and a sense of what they're doing, are navigating this and are able to survive because their mission and their goal of what they were trying to accomplish wasn't wrapped up in the structure that has now been lost. Versus those who have been dependent on those structures in order to understand and give them safety and security in and to begin to even confuse mission with institution. Those are the ones that are struggling more. And I'm drawing an equal sign there is obviously a little dangerous, and making absolutist statements is not that it's not the intention here. But it's just to say that, for instance, my partner's church, she's a pastor of a very small church, but they're thriving right now under this online situation. I mean, it's hard to say thriving given the climate and given the difficulties that this all raises, but she's doing a really great job, if I may say so myself. I'm a little biased, but I think she's doing a very good job with this, because she's doing prayer times twice a day. She's doing, she's keeping all these meetings. She has thoroughly taught an aging congregation how to use Zoom. And after 2 months, they're in it. And, so it's possible for church leaders to find these ways of being. And I mean, some of it's just that it's a remarkable community, as well as a remarkable pastor. But there are signs that it's not just about size, although we'd be lying if we said size wasn't a factor as well. So I think these are things to think about. Anything else that anybody wanted to add? Well, maybe we can move on to the next slide, and we can keep these notions here in mind as we go. And I think that last conversation about mission, I think actually does set us up pretty well for this next piece. And that is, before we jump, what we really want to do is focus on next steps. Where do we go from here? And maybe another way of into that conversation, maybe to be thinking about stopping for a moment and thinking about ourselves and our own mission, the mission of our institutions, and kind of the broader mission that we all share to nurture and support faith leadership. So we're going to leave these two questions. Keep these two questions in mind. You might jot them down in case. I think that might be the easiest way to do this. I'll put them in the chat. Oh, great! Thank you, Steve. So that way, you guys all have access to them as we go. But the questions are any of these? Question one is, any of these emerging strengths and opportunities, everything that we just discussed, causing your understanding of lifelong learning for ministry to evolve in some way? So in other words, how are we thinking about not just, it gets back to Rick's idea of how are we changing, not just in a way of how are we going to handle this crisis? How are we going to get to the next day and the next week? But what are we going to do differently going forward? And it's also, again, asking that question, what is our mission? What is our call? And I also add this, what Pastor recent dangerous memories do you want to keep fresh? If you're familiar with Johann Baptist Metz's concept of the dangerous memory, because I think, there are stories that are emerging through this. There are stories that we have been witness to in these last few hours and days and weeks. There are stories and things that have happened in our past and in our, not just in our local communities, but global, that are pieces of the fabric of our memory, and we always want to carry those with us as we go. The dangerous memories are the ones that we, especially those of us in privilege, very easily want to let go of or can let go of. But when we do, we run the risk of A, missing the point or missing the gospel or missing the mission, and B, leading people out of our vision. The other part is prototypes of new ways of operating. I think that we're already beginning to see that, and some of the questions that we've already raised suggest there are things that we are beginning to try. There are things that some ideas that you may have that you haven't implemented yet. So these are, and I really, in this part of the question, maybe focusing on what's driving that sense of innovation for you. What's inspiring that creativity? And hopefully it's the mission. Hopefully it's that idea that this is what we're doing, and this is how we think we can accomplish it better in this time. So maybe talk about those prototypes and those memories. And that's the first question. And then I'm going to go ahead and mention question 2 here as well, because I think we're just going to open up and have an open conversation with our small groups for a little while. And you can talk about these questions, kind of bounce back and forth between them wherever the conversation goes. But to be thinking about what we're trying to do is move from that, from that SWOT analysis piece towards, okay, so where do we go from here? And so what are the stories, ideals, dreams, hopes that come to mind if you imagine what lifelong learning work at your organization will look like in 5 to 10 years? That's not necessarily a rosy picture, but maybe as we use in these kinds of analyses, the BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goals, that might be part of it for you as well. But what are the things that we we are thinking about, that we're hoping for? And so it's kind of a hodgepodge of a list here, and the conversation can go a lot of different directions. And I think we'd be interested in seeing where those conversations go in your small groups, and wherever they go is the right answer. So take these questions as launching points, and then they'll convert there. And then when we come back, we'll discuss it, and then maybe talk about some, like, what could be next steps for us to do as a pair. So Stephen, if you want to go ahead and break us out.
Sure.
As we do,
Does anybody have any questions?
yeah, I just want to clarify, but the small groups are supposed to talk about both questions each, correct? Or are you, as one group talks about?
Yes, I think all groups talk about all questions.
Okay,
We'll have it nice and open. That way everybody can you can kind of go where the wind blows, so to speak.
Okay. And
All right.
how long do you want us to be in small groups, Josh?
Well, we're at 3:25. Why don't we come back in, let's say, is 20 minutes enough, or 25?
Why don't we say 20 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time to debrief and see where it goes.
Great.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So when you get in your small group, you'll see a countdown timer in the top right corner, and that'll tell you how much time you have left. And down in the bottom right corner, there's a button that says help. So if you need me, push the button and I'll come and help.
And remember to introduce yourself.
All right, Josh. So you said 20 minutes. We were just getting started.
I know, us too. Us too. It was the same thing. Same thing. Well, we're going to go back into our groups here in a minute, and so just pick up where you left off. You know,
Okay.
I think there was enough richness there that I think we could just do that. Does anybody want to, maybe we can do the typing in the comments here of, again, what some of the things that came out of your group here at this point. And just take a few of them. Bye, Helen.
See you guys. Good to see you all.
see ya.
Good to see you too.
And next month it's going to be Frank Yamada, so
Yes, we
I'll be in
definitely don't want to miss
conversation
that.
with him.
Do you want to give us a quick commercial on that before you leave?
Please.
I have no commercial to give because I have to wait until he's done with the biennial meeting and the voting on the new standards before I can talk to him about anything else. So just know he's going to be here. He's going to be talking about the new standards, which actually tack a lot towards competency-based evaluation of schools rather than checklists of resources, and the central role that lifelong learning has in schools behaving competently as training places for future ministerial leaders. So it's going to be fun.
See you next time.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Helen. Nancy left a question here. You all talked about the balance between making connections happen between participants and sharing content with participants. Yes. You want to say more about that, Nancy?
We just talked about how each of those sides of the coin is important to have good content. Some people come mostly for the content, others come for the interaction, but we concluded that finding that fine balance is a challenge sometimes with events.
Yeah.
And also, depending on the platform or form that you use, that can affect how that works as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, how are we adaptable? How are we, and the spiritual and the emotional part, which comes from the making connections. These are all difficult things to balance. Stephen, you have a talk or play between content and personal support of leaders. So basically the same idea here, basically saying,
Yeah,
do you want to
Nancy
say
and I
more?
were in the same group. She just finished typing before I. Yeah, Nancy and I were in the same group. She just finished typing before I did. But I thought I would finish my thought and share it.
Very good. brings them back is that they're not in this alone. Yes, yes. And I think that that's an important role of what I think ALLLM does well is brings people together and creates community. I think, you know, there's a lot of different kinds, and maybe among your organizations as well. I think it's important sharing resources, but also sharing connections and kind of being there for each other is a really valuable resource.
What about the other groups? Since Nancy and I were in the same one, what jumped out at you in your groups?
Well, this is Rick. One of the things we talked about was the various audiences that we're trying to reach. And, you know, it varies from, of course, institution to institution, but looking at, you know, are we reaching just rostered leaders, pastors, and trained lay leaders? Are we're trying to reach out to church leaders, leaders in congregations that are non-rostered, seminarians, you know, who is our audience? And also looking at various formats, particularly as we live into kind of this virtual reality, how does that affect how we provide those kinds of resources and programming to various audiences?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by a rostered leader, Rick? I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure. It's a term I don't use.
Well, for example, in the Lutheran Church, we have pastors, and then we have lay people who have been trained and certified for ministry, who are not pastors. We have word and sacrament and word and service. So we have two different categories. You know, they're both rostered. They're both on the roster, with pastors and then lay people who are doing ministry but not in a pastoral role. Okay.
Do you find, Rick, that there is a growth in, and this actually is a question for everybody, is, you know, there's the question of theological education and alternative forms of theological education, quote unquote.
Yes.
And this idea that there are many different ways to do ministry and that we are thinking beyond kind of the archetypal, somebody goes to seminary and becomes ordained. Where in your denominations and various settings do you find the need for theological education growing, shifting, changing in regards to providing more alternative, quote unquote, needs? And how is this time changing that? How are we becoming potentially more flexible or less?
Well, I'll just say a couple things to that question. First of all, we're also looking at training lay people who are interested in being theologically trained and trained for ministry, who are not necessarily looking for a job, a paid job in congregations, but want to be engaged in significant ministry in their faith communities and in their neighborhoods. So we have, you know, the lay schools that have been popping up around our denomination around the country. So that's one category. We're also looking at alternative routes to ordination. We have a large team program, and these are primarily second career and also people of various ethnic groups other than white who are engaged already in ministry in their communities but are wanting to be theologically trained and to become pastors through an alternative route. And we've already had, before this time of pandemic, we've already had to identify ways to do that training through distance learning. So we've been doing a lot of distance learning in our seminaries, and that's just accelerating now because of this current situation.
Yeah, I would say that's true. Oh, sorry,
deliver education and resources through distance learning in ways that we never have thought of before.
Sorry, are you done now? I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, I think that's very much true in the United Church of Canada. And then there's another level underneath that as well, which would be licensed lay worship leaders and designated lay ministers who are doing more and more training online. And these tend to be people who are raised up locally and are leading tiny little churches in the middle of nowhere. where they could not raise the funds to pay an ordained minister, even if an ordained minister were interested in going there. But we've got more and more congregations across the north and across even wide swatches of the west or out in Newfoundland that have only ever been served by a licensed lay worship leader for years, a generation even. And we're doing more and more of that kind of training online too, because they can't afford to travel to a site.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Stephen. Sarah, you mentioned our group talked about the mix of making space for shorter term responses and ongoing needs. Do you want to say more on that?
Well, I can, and Erica may want to chime in too, but just sort of holding some of that space to be able to know that even if it's a roller coaster, some of the same kinds of things need to take place, preaching and or teaching and pastoral care. And yet there are some times, and some institutions do this already more readily than others, to have responses to racial discord, public health, mental health needs, community crises, and whether it is the Center for Lifelong Learning or a local judicatory or in a seminary setting, maybe another part of the seminary, paying attention to that in your own context, is that something you need to pay attention to and to hold some space for? Yeah.
That's, my former capacities, that was something thinking about was how can we be incubators of space for new initiatives and new opportunities? Can our institutions do that? And whether it's that or something else, some way to be responsive to the needs of what's going on. Can our institutions be creative enough and create that space for potential creative and empowering responses to whatever the crisis du jour is? And this one, of course, we're living in some big ones right now. But how can our institutions be malleable? How can we be responsive, adaptive even?
Mm-hmm.
Israel, implications for theological schools as alternative ordination lay leaders and increase in bivocational pastors. So we were touching on this a little bit. Israel, did you want to say anything else? Any more to add?
Not necessarily more to add, but our conversations just brings to mind again another stressor for theological schools, and I'm wondering if this is about to increase, given what we know that this post-pandemic acute crisis is going to result in deep economic challenges to congregations to keep a full-time ministers and pastors. The increase in alternative ordination paths from many denominations, at least perceived increase in certified lay leaders or trained lay leaders in the church. And I think the trend that we have seen about bivocational pastors, I think seminaries are still geared in their formal theological model, theological educational model, with the assumption that the majority, or at least all of their graduates, are going to go into full-time Christian ministry in a congregational context, and that's I think a reality that's long past. Yeah, absolutely, and that's really helpful. And like you said, I think the changes that have already happening, this might be an accelerant of what was already happening in a lot of ways, and that the financial aspect as well as the bivocational aspects is, I think, really important. And and Sarah mentioned the interfaith piece, I think, is key too. So the related question for theological schools is there a new emergent significance in lifelong learning, continuing education within the landscape of theological education, given this shift?
Well, and I think I appreciate that you brought that up, Israel. I think that this is an example of one of those places that regionally and or denominationally that there could be some rich collaboration, because Rick mentioned the proliferation of some of the lay schools that duplicate the same kind of training,
Yeah.
and with varying competency evaluation and results. And that if there could be enhanced collaboration between centers of lifelong learning and local needs organizations to provide that on a reliable, sort of standardized basis. I think that that's something to pay attention to.
How can our seminaries be community centers?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
One of the things I keep wondering about is what's our understanding of what skill set you need to lead a congregation. And I grew up and was educated in what is probably the last generation of church where everybody leading a church had an academic degree and a master's degree. And that assumed a significant level of ability to write and to think and to read scholars and appreciate scholarship. And I think an awful lot of the training we're doing these days is not emphasizing scholarship or even the skill set of scholars in the same ways. We're training a lot more practical skills, but not so much theological reflection and thinking. And I fear for the church that is going to get theologically thin, at the same time as I'm aware that nobody wants to read more than a 2-page article from a journalist. A lot of the folks that I'm teaching don't ever read the scholars anymore. Maybe they never did, I don't know. But I wonder what we're losing as well as what we're gaining as we're moving into different kinds of education.
And just so that we have enough time to break back out, I want to make sure that we get to Nancy's point, this last point here. Theological institutions and programs may struggle to reach and serve needs of economically poor communities of color and rural communities without good internet access, which is that's a very important aspect. So thank you for bringing that up, Nancy. If you wanted to say any more, please, by all means, do so.
No, just to underscore that's true on the level of our seminary. We don't just have one seminary in our denomination, and also on the level of academic training and ministry preparation on the district level, which would be our judicatory level, middle judicatory level. And actually Janet's much more familiar with that because she directs those programs. And I think you would agree that those are some struggles that we have. We have about 12% of our ministerial body that has not good access to internet. So 12 doesn't sound like much, but when you think about where it's located and how it impacts the level of theological training, it's significant. And then we have a couple communities of color, especially, that have reached out and asked to be served directly by programs. And we just haven't gotten much traction on that in terms of the leadership for a number of reasons, but it just underscores that importance of that need.
This isn't a solution to that, but it reminds me of when teaching this online this last year was a course teaching religion at my university. That the students, a lot of the students were only accessing the course on their phones. Like they didn't have good internet access, but they could use 4G and access or access the things using their phones. And Canvas has an app, so you're able to access things. And I wasn't aware at the beginning. Things that show up on the desktop version aren't showing up in the phone app in the same way. I need to be cognizant of that. So those kinds of things, and we don't talk much about the differences there, but it's very important that especially younger people, and also there may be an socioeconomic aspect, that people have smartphones but may not necessarily have stable landlines or internet connections or wireless at their home. That may be a part of it. So it's a kind of a simple point, but it's something that I think we should be thinking about.
It's huge, and it's not just about theology. You cannot get government assistance in Canada right now if you don't have an internet connection, and all the libraries are closed.
Yeah, this is justice issues relating to internet.
Yeah, the government has run out of forms that employers use to lay off employees.
Yeah.
There are none left in Canada because there have been so many layoffs. The only way you can get a government form to lay off your employee is through the internet.
Yeah.
So if you're on a native reserve in northern Manitoba, you're in trouble. This is a huge issue. It's a justice issue, and it's not just theology, it's the whole society that is struggling with it, and the pandemic has really exacerbated it.
Absolutely.
That's good. And so we only have a few minutes left, so maybe we can break back out and show that last question in terms of next steps. If you want to go back to the conversation that you were having before, by all means. But Steve, if you want to show that last slide there, it's just a question of next steps, specifically about what was the steps that you would like to take from here. What would you like to explore further? What would you like to develop? So that probably leads right into where you were already at and discussing, or you can just kind of take your conversation. I know that Israel mentioned something about educational design, and I think something that our group was talking about was similar. So exploring some of these issues and saying, okay, so how do we develop this further, I think would be very valuable. So let's, we only have about, I guess, at this point, maybe.
Do you want to take 10 minutes for that conversation?
Can we take 10 full minutes, and then our, at the end, probably just a few words of business.
Summary. Mm-hmm.
That sound okay? Yeah.
Okay. And
Okay.
again, I've copied those
Steve.
questions into the chat so you can recover them from the chat when you're in your breakout rooms. Here we go.
Yeah, we were still going hard. So.
Oh, were we too?
Yeah. I think if we scheduled these things for 2 hours, we would
No, not that.
No, we're not doing it. We're not doing that. Don't worry, Steve. We're not doing that. But just saying, if we did, we would still have probably more to say than the time allowed. So
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you all for these great conversations. Do we want to add anything, Steve or Erica or Sarah? Do we want to end with some final notes, or for
Well, I would like the groups that chatted to post at least one key takeaway in the chat so that we can save that and or mention it so it's on the recording. Because did we have 3 groups?
We did have 3 groups.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So our group talked a little bit about instructional design and how important it is to be offering things that include good student engagement and good instructor engagement. And sort of acknowledging again that the lecture is out. But the flip side of that is that there are times when all you want is information, and then you go to YouTube or lynda.com, and maybe you watch 4 different videos on how to change a tire, and then you go out and do your own. And that's also a huge educational resource.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where our group was going, and unless there's somebody else in the group who wants to add more to that.
Just to kind of piggyback on that, Steve, we talked about how this organization could provide a webinar on instructional design using new technologies. Mm-hmm. And we kind of morphed into talking about how we also can be coaches and mentors, depending on the situation, to help our various institutions know how to do this.
That's great.
A huge part of what I do, Rick. I am constantly bringing new facilitators into Leader Webinar, and most of my work happens ahead of time as I'm massaging the curriculum with the person. And gee, that's a great idea. Why don't you reframe it this way? And I spent oodles of time doing that.
Yeah, that's great.
By the time we get onto the webinar, I'm in the background and they're doing their thing, and they come away feeling great. But yeah, I'm more of a coach than anything else, I think.
Is there another group we haven't heard from?
Well, I think our group, what we talked about taps into a little bit of this instruction design question of, and it had to do with a tension that we feel between, okay, there are times when we're actually creating more empowerment and more community. in our sense of learning together, and a learning that involves doing. I think Mike was talking a little bit about this with a webinar that he was a part of, that there's this greater sense of community learning together that's not just focused on the teacher, that's happening really well in these settings. But on the other hand, you have that access issue. And in that access issue, when you're doing something synchronous, like we're doing right now, where we're all together in the same time, you might have issues of bandwidth. You might have issues of access. And also there's a learning curve for people, and that different issue of people are not used to this kind of learning. And so you have to take some time to get people on board to be able to do it. And then of course that requires them to have the finances and the internet connection in order to be able to access it well. Versus if you're doing something asynchronously, which is how we are often told that's better for online learning. At least I have been told that. So you do things asynchronously and you're able to create more opportunities for people to access. I know that for my teaching, I really had to do almost everything asynchronous in order for it to work. But then you miss out, how do you create community? How do you keep that sense of connection and that sense of learning together and that sense of empowered learning together? How do you keep that going? So that's that dynamic that I think we're learning to play with. And I think that anything that we do with talking about instructional design should look at that dynamic and see how can we negotiate it well.
Thanks. Something I wanted to add from our group that we talked about as well is, if we are here to share ideas, to collaborate, to have new frameworks for thinking about this, who is missing from our conversation today?
Yes.
Who needs to be here? And how do we invite them in?
Yeah.
Did you answer the question?
No, that's a
Did you
question.
begin to answer it?
That's a harder question.
But we can each identify some folks and do some of that, and we'll flesh that out some more. I think Josh has some summary things that he wants to share with us before we conclude.
Do I?
Don't you?
Well, I think
Give us the answers.
I know. Well, I think that idea of what we were talking about with design, I think, is really key. I think that these are some next steps that we can look at. There was a lot of good insights that I found. Honestly, I've got a whole page here of stuff that I'm just like, oh my goodness, we could talk. There's just so much wisdom in this group of things that we can go. So I think I'm just really thankful for all of you and how we have worked together to share this wisdom. And I think we'll find a way to make that accessible, right, Steve?
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds good.
He says blithely, I will try to make sure that the recording is available to you sooner this time. I had it all set and posted at YouTube and forgot to send out a link to everybody. I apologize for that.
So we've got a very practical charge here from Janet to do something that incorporates all of these aspects. I think that would be the challenge, and I think that gives us something to focus on. We've got a great webinar planned for June to work with July. This is June. The months are blending together, people. July with Frank Yamada to talk about the ATS standards and accreditation that Sarah was talking about. But following that, I think something on instructional design seems like it would be really valuable. And I think, and that anybody who is interested in helping the team work on that, we'd love feedback, input. I know I'm speaking for people, but I think the team would love to hear from folks who have ideas and resources that can help us develop that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And because this is, shameless admissions here, we hoped for some clear sense of direction from this group. We are hearing the sense of direction, and we believe that it is something that we can, Israel just pointed to Wabash. We believe that it is something that we can help facilitate and offer. Mm-hmm. And thank you all for your input. Now, Josh, did you want to mention Slack or not?
Sure. I'm trying to copy the link here. There we go. So I just put a link in the chat. If you're familiar with the format with the Slack with the Slack app, which is it's a desktop and as a phone app. It works better as a phone app, but it does work as a desktop app. And that is a great place to have community, responsive community. I think we were talking before about the value of ALLLM as a community and a network of people who can share these resources together and continue conversations that we're starting in these webinars. We can keep them going, continue to have conversations, and this might be a way to do it. So we've created a Slack group that the 4 of us on the leadership team are a part of. We invite you all with that invite, go ahead and join us, and we try to continue the conversation that way. And if you're not familiar with Slack, feel free to talk to me or message me through the app or email me, and we can talk about any help that you need with the app. I'm sure other people would be willing to help as well. But it's just a way to connect. I know there's Facebook and there's other ways of doing it, but this is kind of internal. It's also it's responsive, it's quick, and it keeps the conversations organized in different ways. So that's something that I think would be a way to kind of continue the conversation as we go forward, and not just monthly.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
And I also posted the ATS Engage is a forum of the Association of Theological Schools. You have to do a little screening thing. They don't have separate lifelong learning discussion groups yet, but perhaps if they see more of us there, they will be more motivated to do so.
Excellent. Excellent.
And it is one of the places that I have begun to, have shared more actively our webinars and that kind of thing.
That's great. Thank you.
And I think to acknowledge the reason that we've invited Frank Yamada next month is that the proposal coming to the Association of Theological Schools around changing the accreditation requirements of schools could or is recommending a significant enhancement of the place of continuing education. And this could well be an important boost to all of our programming. Schools are expected to talk about the importance of continuing education for their students and alumni, and to embed into their curriculum ways to enhance that. So I don't have the exact wording off the top of my head, and it hasn't been approved yet, but Frank Yamada has been central to these new standards and to that conversation. So it has a direct bearing on what we do. If schools are going to have to offer this kind of programming and enhance it and teach their current students that it's important to come back after they graduate to take it, then we need to be prepared to follow up on that with substantive programming that they will find engaging. But there'll be some institutional support for that. So we thought it was important to engage with Yamada about that and think about what kind of impact that might have on the sorts of programming that we're doing in accredited schools, or that you're doing. I'm not in an accredited school, but you are, or many of you are, that you're doing already, or that people like me in the judicatory need to be aware of, because our schools are going to start to beef up this programming too. So that's kind of the purpose behind the next month's webinar. We don't have an outline organized yet, but that's why we're doing it, and that's where we're going with it, and I think it's important.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and Israel mentions here, you can check out the ATS website to get the language and the wording of the new standards if you want to look that up yourselves. Thank you all again. Does somebody, could I ask somebody to close us in prayer? Would anybody like to volunteer?
I will close us with prayer then. Since I prayed us in, let me pray us out too.
Thank you, Steve.
Let's gather ourselves. Gracious God, you speak to us in so many different ways and in different languages and in different cultures and through different media. And you have gathered us to find commonalities and to reflect on where you are leading all of us in the midst of changing times. As we go back into our own institutions, keep us open to the proddings of your Spirit. Keep us adaptive, keep us engaged, keep us excited by the directions you lead. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all again.
Thank you all for this fast-paced hour and a half.
Sure was.
Thanks for your
Thank you.
leadership.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Next time.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.